Welcome back to an introduction to oceanography from the textbook Essentials of Oceanography, the 8th edition, brought to you by Cengage Learning and by Tom Harrison and Robert Ellis. Of course, I'm Dave Cocchiarella, and we're talking about marine communities today. Now, a lot of times when folks take oceanography, they're thinking about dolphins and seals, but really, as we've learned, we've mostly been talking about the physical processes of the ocean. And today we are talking about marine communities, but not necessarily marine biology. But what we know about the marine communities is that they are affected by all the systems of the earth as much as they're affected by sunlight and photosynthesis. They're also affected by geology and erosion and deposition and plate tectonics. And so again, it's one world ocean that's part of a complete global system, and that global system, not just the physical earth, but the space that the earth resides in as well. So let's talk about marine communities, starting with the key concepts. And in this chapter, marine communities, we'll be talking about the fact that a community is composed of many populations of organisms, and like all systems on earth, those communities, those populations are interacting, and in this case, in one particular location. Marine communities consist of interacting producers. They take sunlight and they create protein, and then consumers that consume those producers and also consume vegetation. Decomposers are the ones that recycle. They're the bacteria that break it all down. And the composition of the community, of course, is going to change. It's never going to be static, but it's going to change as resources change. Maybe a community that has tons of blooming plankton suddenly has less nitrogen and less phosphorus because people around it stop putting fertilizer on their lawn. Maybe now in the future, with less of those resources available, you'll have a few of those plankton, or maybe there's just more clouds for one reason or the other, and there's less sunlight. So communities are always changing. Open ocean communities are composed of plankton that drift and nekton, or nectonic creatures, things that actually swim. Shoreline communities exist where the land meets the sea, pretty straightforward, and they typically are very rich in diversity, despite the fact that they're also usually in very rigorous conditions, like the seashore, or maybe like a tidal bay. Shallow benthic marine communities thrive in structures created by coral. So we're talking about shallow water coral communities, also maybe kelp beds like seaweed, and then other marine plant ecosystems. And then open ocean pelagic, so you've got your benthic and your pelagic. The pelagic communities exist in the water above the deep ocean basin, so in that sunlit zone. And the deep ocean, way down there deep, also, in fact, it does support some kind of strange communities out there. So we're going to take a look at least to some detail in all of these and get an idea of these different types of communities. So marine organisms live in communities. A community is many particular populations of organisms that interact in that particular location. A population is a group of organisms of the same species in that same location. A habitat is an organism's physical location. Sometimes we think of it as an address. And then a niche is an organism's occupation. What does it do in that community? Its relationship, it's considered its relationship to its food, it eats it, and also its enemies. It gets eaten by its enemies. And so those are the basic definitions: community, population, habitat, and niche, that you need to have a solid understanding of as we consume this material. So marine communities do exhibit remarkable diversity, not only in their composition of the actual community, but in the locations where they can thrive. Again, you can have shallow water near the ocean, or clear water in a tropical ocean, or you can have something down deep in the Marianas Trench. So scientists divide the marine environment into zones. A pelagic zone, which is the open water, and there's the neritic pelagic zone, which is near shore over the continental shelf, and then there's the oceanic pelagic zone, which is beyond the continental shelf. Now, there are tons and tons of these dividers, and it's a good idea to have a general understanding of each of these terms, although some of them are fairly odd: neritic, pelagic, but it's something you should have an understanding of. I always like to think of the stingray in Finding Nemo singing about the different zones of the ocean. The benthic zone is the bottom, so you have the littoral zone, which is that intertidal area, the surf zone, where the waves wash up just beyond the surf zone. We have the sublittoral zone, which is, as you might expect, just beyond the littoral zone. The bathal zone, which slopes down to very, very deep depths. The abyssal zone, which is down in those deep depths. And then the hadal zone, which is considered to be the deepest part of the ocean. And here's a look at that all those different zones. So there's your littoral zone, which is basically from the high tide mark down into the surf zone, neritic. And then you look at the continental shelf out here, and so you have your pelagic zones, the epipelagic, which is pretty shallow, meso, the bathic, the bathypelagic, and then here's your abyssal zone, which is going to be very, very deep, and then your hadal zone, which is typically in your deep ocean trenches. And again, just a reminder, or sort of go over again the idea of ocean basins. Here is your continental shelf, and then from your continental shelf, the slope goes down to the abyssal plain. Now, in the scale of this particular image, it looks like the abyssal plain is flat, but really the abyssal plain can go for hundreds of thousands of miles, very, very flat, and then it's interrupted by deep sea trenches. Some very active margins will have the deep sea trenches right up against the continental slope, like off California, off Peru, but in general, the abyssal plain extends for great distances before you get any type of trenching. And so, again, this is sort of a compressed version of what the ocean looks like in the different zones of the ocean. But again, it does tie into those ocean basins, which tie into tectonics and how different margins are passive or active. So the pelagic community occupies the open ocean, and they are divided into two broad groups, plankton and nekton. So plankton we think of as plankton from SpongeBob SquarePants, but there's lots of different types of plankton. There's zooplankton, there's phytoplankton, so there's zooplankton, which would be, I guess his name was Plankton, with the eyeball. He was a living biota. He was a creature that was a plankton, and then which would be zooplankton, and then there's phytoplankton, which are just plants. But they drift. Now, some plankton actually have some locomotion abilities, but it's not enough to swim against the current. So they may be able to move from one spot to the other in the current, but basically they are drifters. Nekton, or nektonic organisms, they actively swim. So anything that actively swims is going to be a nektonic organism, and of course, that's going to include your fishes. Phytoplankton are autotrophic. So remember, autotrophic means they make their own food. They take sunlight, and they use chlorophyll, and they change the carbon dioxide and the water into carbohydrates, and then they expel oxygen. So you have phytoplankton, which are autotrophic plankton that use the photosynthesis to create carbohydrates, essentially to create their own food. And phytoplankton, kind of an astounding number, phytoplankton swimming in the ocean or drifting in the ocean are thought to have to bind at least half of the food made by photosynthesis on Earth. So that's how important the ocean is. When we start talking about the problems with the ocean, that's how important it is. Half of the food made by photosynthesis occurs with the phytoplankton. And picoplankton are extremely small forms of cyanobacteria, single-cell bacteria, and they're very, very small. And the picoplankton actually have their own little systems within the greater system. And they are very, very small and something we're only really beginning to understand. Phytoplankton are photosynthetic autotrophs. We said that phytoplankton are basically plants, and they take oxygen. They take carbon dioxide and sunlight and water, and they make their carbohydrates. And some examples of those, not all of them, but some examples are one called a diatom, and they are very efficient at photosynthesis. And 55% of sunlight's energy is converted into the energy of chemical bonds. So they're very efficient. They can take 50% of the energy from the sun and actually create chemical bonds with it. And they store that energy as fatty acids and oil within their actual silica structure. And then there's dinoflagellates, and they are single-celled autotrophs that use flagella, or that's where they get flagellate from, to actually move. So couple different types of phytoplankton that are out there. And here is that loop. So you can see that the really small plankton have their own little micro loop. They're not actually part of the bigger loop. So you have your official food chain of larger planktonic organisms, which is sort of in contrast with what we refer to here as the black market economy of that microbial loop. So the itty bitty tiny ones, they're in their own little loop. There's some crossover there at the smallest level, but fishes don't eat the microplankton. So larger planktonic organisms are unable to separate the very, very small cyanobacteria and microscopic consumers from the water, so they don't use them as food. Other plankton may use them as a type of food. All right, so phytoplankton productivity varies with local conditions, right? If it's super cloudy all year long, then you're not going to get a whole lot of photosynthesis going on. Again, I talked about the presence of nitrogen and phosphorus, or maybe even just the presence of carbon dioxide in the water. So those are limiting agents, and if those vary, local conditions vary, then the amount of productivity can vary. So phytoplankton distribution corresponds with nutrient distribution. And one of the things that's interesting about water, seawater, is that gases dissolve more readily in very, very cold water. And so where you have upwelling, or cold water from the depths being pulled up closer to the surface, that's where you tend to have the highest nutrient levels. And so we think about the coast of California, where they have smelt and sardines and all those little fishes that feed off of smaller organisms that feed off of plankton. They're there. We don't have those schools of smelt and sardines off the East Coast. They're there on the West Coast because there's that trench off the West Coast of California, and cold water upwells out of that trench. And off the coast of South America, the West Coast of South America, cold water upwells out of those deeper trenches, very nutrient rich, and there's lots of plankton because of it, lots of plants and lots of fishes, and that's where you get these massive schools of protein swimming around. So nutrient levels are highest near the coastlines. You get coastal upwelling, as I mentioned, and then you also have runoff from land, and runoff from land also produces some of the nutrients. I think somewhere in this course we've already discussed this. One of the things that's really important to understand about the ocean in general, at the very large scale level, is the fact that the ocean started out as fresh water. Water vapor, condensed as the planet cooled and turned into water that filled the basins, and then possibly some asteroids or comets, delivered some ice, frozen water that is, to the planet. But it all started out fresh. It was the erosion of the land, and then the transportation of the sediment and the deposition of the sediment, particularly the dissolved sediment, into the ocean, that caused it to be salty. So why isn't the ocean just continuing to get salty? Because some of those chemical components are also precipitating out of the ocean. So what we're sort of at a steady state here at 4.6 billion years of age, where as much salts are going into the ocean as are precipitating out. Nonetheless, nutrient levels are highest near land runoff as well. Open tropical oceans, typically pretty low in nutrient plankton. Clear water is indication there's not much plankton there. The strong thermocline, meaning the fact that it's very warm at the surface and then colder below, that warm water is lighter and rises to the top, the cold water is heavier and sinks to the bottom, and you don't get a lot of vertical mixing, and that's called the thermocline, that difference between warm water at the top and cold water at the bottom. We've talked about this, but the thermocline basically keeps those nutrients down in the lower depths of the ocean, so you don't get it. So why is it so beautiful and clear and crystal clear water in the Bahamas? Well, it's because the water's warm and you don't get any nutrients mixing up. But you might think, but what about all those lush tropical communities? They have tons of life. Well, they do, right there at the surface. But in the water column itself, you don't find much in the way of any life. Yeah, there's some fishes swimming around, but not a large population of any type of protein. So again, phytoplankton productivity varies with local conditions, and what you're looking at here is chlorophyll content. So oceanic productivity observed from satellites. The satellite was launched in '97. It can detect the amount of chlorophyll in the ocean. Chlorophyll content provides an estimate of productivity. So your reds and your greens indicate high productivity, and your blues indicate low. So where is it high? Well, right here where the Amazon spills into the Atlantic, there's a lot of nutrients pouring out. So you're getting a lot of productivity there. And then you're getting this productivity here in the Pacific, where the northeast trade winds and the southeast trade winds take cooler, nutrient-rich water and sort of push them right along the equator there. So that's where you're getting that stream there. And then your chillier waters, and particularly your chillier waters along these coastlines, they are high in productivity right off the west coast of South America. You get high productivity here on the west coast of Africa as well. But again, tropical waters and then open waters, you don't have a whole lot of productivity. Zooplankton, of course, this is like plankton from SpongeBob. Zooplankton, they actually eat those primary producers. They eat the phytoplankton. So zooplankton are planktonic organisms that they drift, but they eat other plankton, and they could eat other zooplankton too. So they're heterotrophic, not autotrophic. Autotrophic, you make it yourself. Heterotrophic, you go out and you have to get dinner at the restaurant. So we're heterotrophic. You and I are heterotrophic. Zooplankton only make up about 10% though of phytoplankton. There's not a ton of them out there. Large variety. Copepods, jellyfish are actually considered to be plankton. holoplankton, meroplankton, krill, and copepods are these tiny crustaceans, huge amount of the zooplankton that exists. And then krill are those little shrimp. They're zooplankton, the little shrimp, but they have this amazing role in the ocean because so many of the vast, massive creatures that are called filter feeders, they just swim along, and whatever goes into their mouth, they filter out. They filter out mostly this krill, your blue whales, and your humpback whales. They're going to be filter feeders. Your certain sharks are filter feeders, the really big ones. And there's a bunch of really huge fish that just can take in massive amounts of protein because of this massive amount of krill out there, and they expend very little energy because they're not trying to hunt down fish to eat. So they expend very little energy, they take in massive amounts of protein, and they get really big. All right, so nektons, or nektonic animals, those that can swim, mostly vertebrates, they dominate the open ocean. So what's in the open ocean? Fish swimming around, right? Fish, reptiles, marine birds, marine mammals, they're considered nektonic. And not fish, the marine mammals, they have spinal cords, they have vertebrae, and they swim around. A couple are invertebrate, the squids and the nautiluses. And the nautilus is a shelled animal that comes from the deep depths. It's, squids, your cephalopods, they are going to be, squids are going to be nektonic. Cephalopods, correction here, are pelagic invertebrates, for instance, squids, nautili, and octopus, and they're out there in the open ocean swimming around. They are nektonic, pelagic invertebrates swimming around, and they're all known as cephalopods. They all have multi-limbs. Split limbs is what cephalopod means. Pods means foot or limb or leg, and cephalopods means it's split. So fishes are the most abundant and successful vertebrates on Earth. There's more species of fishes, and there's more individual fishes, and there's more species than individuals fishes than any other vertebrates combined on Earth. There's just more fish than anything else. They live in a very wide variety of habitats, and they, of course, are not plants. They're animals. They take oxygen out of the water. They use their gills to do that, and that's how they get their oxygen. And they exhale carbon dioxide just like we do. And about 1/4 of all those fish, the bony fish that is, exhibit schooling behavior at some point, not the entire time, but at some point during their lives. Benthic organisms, so if they're benthic, not pelagic, if they're benthic, they're on the seafloor. Pelagic are out in the open ocean, so you have your pelagic nektonic and your pelagic planktonic. So your pelagic nektonic swim, your pelagic planktonic, they drift, and then you have your benthic, and your benthic are the ones that live or are attached to the ocean floor. Kelp forests are attached. You have pelagic animals in rocky intertidal zones, the crabs and whatnot that are hanging out there. Sand beaches also have crabs, salt marshes. Also areas around deep vents. Anything that lives along a coral reef, those are considered to be benthic creatures, benthic habitats, as opposed to pelagic, which is in the open ocean. So here's an example of a benthic habitat. This is going to be your marine shoreline, rocky intertidal zone, and the book has a detail of all the little creatures that are in this particular picture, but the rocky intertidal zone is the band that exists between the highest high tide and the lowest low tide mark. So it's never always covered with water. It may be covered with water a lot of the time, but it's not always covered with water. At some point, low tide is low enough, and other times water's over with high tide. Definitely has an impact from the rising and falling tide, and also wave shock. So it's very active community. A lot going on, a lot of water moving, and it's a rough place to live. There tends to be a lot of spawning going on here, so there's typically a large quantity of food, and there's a huge diversity of successful organisms in that area. Another shoreline community are sand and cobbled beach communities, pretty hostile for smaller environments. That's why these little coquina shells that you can see, and if you go to the beach here in Florida, you can see the coquina shell when the wave washes up and washes the sand away, they get exposed, and then they immediately begin digging back down in the sand. And the same thing as a little sand flea that I used to catch as a kid to go fishing with. They get washed away, the wave washes the sand away, and then they're exposed and they dig down deep because that hostile environment is really tough on the smaller organisms. Not only because it's so rough, but also the sand is rough. I mean, if you look at sand is basically glass broken into teeny tiny pieces. So it's sharp. And it's sharp enough that if you're a soft-bodied creature, and that's small enough, it can cut you into pieces and kill you. So it's a tough place to live. It's difficult to separate food from sand particles. It's also difficult to keep away from predators and rocks and waves. And we know how rough it is and how much energy there is just looking at the fact that rocks on beaches tend to be rounded. They've been worn and rounded, and those rocks that roll around and cobbles that roll around can also just crush smaller creatures. So it's a tough place to live if you're a small guy right there in the surf zone. Salt marshes and estuaries extremely important, sometimes even considered wetlands. There's a time when we were filling in wetlands and draining salt marshes and using them for development, but now we know how important they are. And for the biggest reason is just about every big fish starts in an estuary or a marsh. Everything big, anything that we eat, consume, probably started out in one of these estuaries. So oftentimes they're muddy bottomed, and they're probably the most active benthic. Again, benthic is stuck to the ground, stuck to the seafloor, not pelagic, out in the water. Most active benthic communities, seagrasses, mangroves, those vascular plants. Very, very high because there's tons of nutrients there. And again, most, or many at least, pelagic species, those that swim out in the ocean, spend their larval, their baby days, living in estuaries. So estuaries are incredibly important in places like the Indian River Lagoon and the Banana River Lagoon, Mosquito Lagoon, and estuaries all up and down the eastern seaboard with the Outer Banks and up into the Delmarva. Incredibly important because most of the big fish swimming out in the ocean started out there. Other examples of shallow benthic marine communities, coral reefs. And so what is a coral reef? A coral reef, the physical rocky, sometimes even sharp or fans or whatever it is, that is what has been secreted by what's known as a coral polyp. And a polyp is a tiny little animal. It's the top picture there on the right. Tiny little animals, they take in nutrients from water, and they change the carbon dioxide and calcium in the water to calcium carbonate, which is just essentially limestone or coral reef. And they grow about 1 inch a year. So you think of these massive coral reefs like the Great Barrier Reef, that'll give you an idea of how much time it took for that to exist and to be there. And then we can come along and in a year bleach it with acidification of the ocean. So these coral reefs are precious, but they can go away easily. And we can look at geologic history and see there were times when there were no coral reefs. And so none of those coral reef animals were around. And there are other times where there's lots of coral reefs. So the idea that coral reefs can go away, not at all out of the question. Very real situation in our ocean. So coral reefs, very densely populated. Again, those individual coral animals are called polyps. They capture any plankton that drift by within reach of their little tentacles. They provide they provide a home for lots and lots of other creatures. And coral reefs, you don't need me to tell you, are very important. Seaweeds are another community here. They carry out about 2 to 5% of the primary productivity, meaning photosynthesis. They can be very, very long, 180, 200 feet long, some of the biggest kelp. And of course, they do provide shelter for benthic animals. And some pelagic animals also hang around in kelp beds. Coastal environments, sea turtles, seabirds, lots of cool stuff. Lots of sea turtles live near coral reefs and seagrass meadows. The salt glands concentrate and secrete excess salts from bodily fluids. So, how do these living creatures that might typically, like a reptile, needs fresh water? Well, how does a manatee or a dolphin or a whale or a turtle get their fresh water? Well, they have the ability to take out salts out of the water. Sea turtles, if you know from Central Florida, typically come back to the same beach that they were born on and lay their eggs, and that's a pretty cool thing to see. And interestingly enough, most seabirds actually live down in the southern hemisphere where there's tons more ocean. So now on to everybody's favorite marine mammals. They are, of course, the prominent members of many coastal communities. And we are talking about whales and dolphins and manatees and sea lions and walruses and tons of different little creatures. And there's a great schematic in the book. It's a little compressed here, tough to see everything, but to give you an idea of the size of some of these animals. And so you get your sperm whale, and it eats, right? It's not a filter feeder, but your gray whale and your right whale and a lot of these other whales over here are actually filter feeders. They strain all that krill, and they become massive because of it. The orca, streamlined like a torpedo, but much smaller because it actually has to use its energy to catch food, and all the way down to the different dolphins that exist. And there's the bottlenose dolphin, and of course it's not just manatees, but there's also a thing called the dugong that lives out there, and there's different types of manatees. So streamlined body shape obviously allows them to swim. They generate and conserve internal heat, and they have a modified respiratory system. Obviously, they're able to breathe at the top of their heads, their blowholes, and they have some osmotic adaptations so the salt water doesn't go into their bodies. Osmosis otherwise would force salt out of the ocean into their freshwater bodies, and so they have adaptations that keep that from happening. We're going to begin to kind of wrap things up marine community-wise, talking about examples of deep sea marine communities, and they're bizarre. There's some interesting things that come about with deep sea creatures. They tend to get really, really large. If you look in the pictures over B, these are shrimp that are typically quite small, that are gigantic. But because they live in a low energy environment, typically down in the depths of the ocean, they're also very, very fragile. They can fall apart very, very easily. Many of them live what are known as near hydrothermal vents, which is where the heat of Earth tectonics, that is typically spreading ridges, the heat of the magma near the surface, heats seawater that gets down into the basaltic seafloor, and that water is heated. It expands, becomes less dense, and rises to the top and comes out of these vents. Sometimes they're called black smokers or white smokers, depending on whether the nutrients, or the minerals in the water turns them black or white. There's also cold water that seeps out of the cracks in the ocean as well. And then there's a very interesting concept referred to as whale fall communities. And these are the fact that whale carcasses litter the abyssal floor, but are in fairly close proximity. And some of these creatures, because there's nothing else on the abyssal floor, can go from one carcass to the next and actually move across great expanses of ocean using dead whale bodies. So back in '76, the bicentennial of this country, scientists discovered previously unknown animals clustered near jets of superheated water blasting from rift vents along the young oceanic ridges. So remember, tectonics, you have converging plates, you have transform plates that slide by each other, and then you have diverging plates where the Earth's crust is literally splitting apart. Hot magma is rising up from the core mantle boundary. Because it's hot, it's less dense, it rises up, it literally lifts the crust up, literally lifts it up, it buoys it up, causes that crust to split, and then gravity allows the crust on either side of that split to slide down that lifted region of the crust, and you get an oceanic ridge. It's lifted up and it's split apart, and magma wells up at the center of that rift and that rift valley. So magma is very close to the surface, so any water that seeps down into cracks in the seafloor becomes superheated, and then be forced up because it becomes hot, becomes less dense, and it gets forced up through cracks in the seafloor. And that's how we get these blasts, the hydrothermal vents. 3,000 meters, 10,000 feet below the surface. A lot of the creatures, most of the creatures around there have to use chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis. Photosynthesis uses sunlight to create carbohydrates. Chemosynthesis is going to use chemicals to do the same thing because there is no sunlight 10,000 feet below the surface. And there's some creepy, icky bacteria and different worms that live down there. A lot of very, very, very unique creatures that live down near these thermal vents. So here's just kind of a cutaway, and again, not in any way to scale, where you've got water that seeps down into, far away from the ridge. Water is going to percolate down. So water well away from the ridge enters the seabed and then percolates downward. Then it eventually comes into contact with rocks that are heated by the nearby magma chamber. We just talked about this. The water is heated, so it expands and rises up, what we refer to as a convection current, hot going up, cool going down. As it rises, the water, that hot water, dissolves, this is the important part, dissolves a mineral from the surrounding basalt. Now, basalt is that low silica rock that comes out of the magma on the seafloor. And so when the water comes up out of the crack, typically it shoots up from the seabed, and those minerals condense in that cooler water to create this chimney. And you can see in this is sort of be the chimney forming here, because you get condensation of minerals, and these chimneys sometimes grow up from these vents and they look like chimneys, and then the smoker, the water flows out of it. And some of those chimneys, this little structure here, can actually grow to as high as 66 feet. So they're quite elaborate and quite tall. So one of the questions about organisms around the hydrothermal vent is how do they get from that vent? Because this nutrient-rich water, the heat from the vent, that only really extends a few yards away from the vent itself. Beyond that, it's just the black abyss of the deep, cold ocean. So how does any of these organisms get from one to the other? If there may be another vent 500 yards away, but if there's no organism near that vent, if that vent has just sprung up, it wasn't there before, now it is there, some tectonics broke some cracks in the crust, now there's water rushing up. How do those creatures get over there? They don't spontaneously exist because the nutrients are there. How do they get over there? Well, the stepping stone theory has been advanced, and again, this is that whale fall. That whale carcasses could possibly provide stepping stones for organisms to drift from one carcass to the next until they actually arrive at a new active vent. And so that is the whale fall theory. And here is an image of the seafloor, one of these whale carcasses. Now, this one's been completely stripped to the bone, but you can imagine this whale died for whatever reason, old age, sick, big injury, and this massive whale, because you can see this is a big old whale, drops to the bottom of the ocean, and it could take many years for it to be completely consumed. But how many different organisms would be involved in that, and how do they get there, and where do they go once the whale carcass is done? So this is the stepping stone theory of what happens on the seafloor. Very interesting concept. And that pretty much wraps up marine communities. And of course, we want to thank Cengage Learning and the authors of the book Oceanography, or Essentials of Oceanography, the 8th edition, Tom Garrison and Robert Ellis. And of course, this is for our course Introduction to Oceanography. So that's going to wrap up kind of a brief conversation about marine communities. We've learned a whole lot about the ocean. And coming up next, we want to begin to talk about the uses for the ocean. What is it good for? What's the point of it? Why can't we just dump stuff in it? And that gets to the abuses of the ocean. So join me next time for Essentials of Oceanography, 8th edition, Uses and Abuses of the Ocean, and that is for Introduction to Oceanography.